there is a temple in the heart of modern Luxor that has never stopped being used. For more than 3,400 years, from the reign of Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC to the present day, this building has been continuously occupied by some form of worship. It was a temple to Amun-Ra. It was a Roman fortress. It was a Christian church. It is right now a 13th century mosque, the Mosque of Abu al-Haggag, which sits on top of the ancient columns, its minaret rising above the pharaonic walls, its faithful gathering for prayers every Friday, in a structure built on the shoulders of a god who has been dead for 1,700 years. No other building in the world contains this kind of layering. No other structure on earth holds, within its walls, the unbroken continuity of 34 centuries of human worship: Egyptian, Roman, Christian, Islamic, each tradition building on the bones of the last, none of them willing to abandon the site that all of them, across every era and every faith, recognized as sacred. This is Luxor Temple. And the question it poses is not the question most visitors expect. The question is not, how was it built? That story is well documented. The work of Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, and a dozen lesser pharaohs, whose contributions can be read in the stone. The question is deeper, stranger, and more unsettling. Why has this place never stopped being holy? Consider what that means. The worship of Amun-Ra ended in the 4th century of the Common Era, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples. The Romans converted part of the temple into a fortress and a cult chapel, painting frescoes of Roman emperors over the pharaonic reliefs. Christians built a church inside the temple's courtyard. Muslims built a mosque on top of the church. Each conversion was an act of replacement, a new faith claiming the sacred ground of an old one. And yet, in every case, the new faith chose this specific site, not the site next door, not a new location, this one, this ground, this building. As if the sacredness were not in the religion, but in the place itself, embedded in the stone, woven into the bedrock, independent of whatever god happened to be worshipped there at any given century. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why Luxor Temple was built, what it meant to the pharaohs who constructed it, how it functioned as the most important ceremonial site in ancient Egypt, and why the ground on which it stands has been holy for longer than any other continuously sacred site in the world. You're going to understand the Ipet festival, the annual ritual that renewed the pharaoh's divine power and required a procession of nearly 3 kilometers through the streets of ancient Thebes. And you're going to understand why, when the last pharaoh's priest walked away and the last torch was extinguished, the holiness did not leave with him. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Luxor Temple, you must first understand what it was not. It was not a temple in the way that most Egyptian temples were temples. The great state temples of Egypt, Karnak, Abydos, Edfu, Dendera, were houses of the gods. Their primary function was to shelter the cult statue of a deity, to provide a setting for daily rituals, and to serve as the earthly residence of a divine being. Luxor Temple served a different purpose. It was not primarily the house of a god. It was the house of the royal Ka, the divine essence of Egyptian kingship itself. The temple was the place where the pharaoh was renewed, where his divine authority was confirmed, where the cosmic legitimacy of his rule was annually re-established through the most important religious ceremony in the Egyptian calendar, the Ipet festival. The ancient Egyptians called Luxor Temple Ipet Resyt, the southern sanctuary, or the southern harem of Amun. The word Ipet carries connotations of both sanctuary and private quarters, a place of intimacy, of seclusion, of divine encounter. The harem designation is not sexual in the modern sense. It refers to the private chambers where a god dwelt in his most intimate form, where Amun was not the cosmic king of the gods, but a more personal, more accessible, more physically present being. Karnak was Amun's public residence, the administrative center, the great temple, the seat of power. Luxor Temple was his private residence, the place where the god came to rest, to regenerate, to renew himself, and, through himself, to renew the king. This distinction between Karnak and Luxor, between public power and private regeneration, is essential to understanding the Opet festival and, by extension, the entire theological program of New Kingdom Egypt. The festival, which lasted between 11 and 27 days depending on the period, involved the transport of the sacred statue of Amun from Karnak to Luxor Temple, roughly 3 kilometers to the south. The statue was carried in a golden bark, a model boat, ornately decorated, borne on the shoulders of priests, through the streets of Thebes in a grand procession, accompanied by musicians, dancers, acrobats, soldiers, and the entire population of the city. The procession moved along the Avenue of Sphinxes, the ceremonial road lined with hundreds of ram-headed and human-headed sphinxes that connected the two temples. At Luxor Temple, the statue of Amun was placed in the inner sanctuary. There, in the darkness of the Holy of Holies, the god merged with the royal car, the divine essence of kingship that was distinct from the individual king, but that inhabited him for the duration of his reign. The merger was a renewal, a recharging of the king's divine batteries, a confirmation that the cosmic order remained intact, that the pharaoh was still the legitimate ruler, that Amun still endorsed his authority. When the rituals were complete, the bark was returned to Karnak, the festival ended, and the king emerged renewed, his power refreshed, his legitimacy confirmed, his connection to the divine reaffirmed. The Opet festival was not a quaint local tradition. It was the central political and religious event of the Egyptian state. The reliefs that depict it, carved on the walls of Luxor Temple's great colonnade by Tutankhamun and completed by Horemheb and Seti I, show a spectacle of staggering scale. Soldiers march in formation, musicians play harps, lutes, and drums, dancers perform acrobatic feats, Nubian wrestlers compete, cattle are slaughtered for public feasting, beer and wine flow freely. The entire population of Thebes lines the processional route, cheering, singing, and celebrating the renewal of their king's divine power. The reliefs are extraordinarily detailed. Individual musicians can be identified by their instruments. Individual dancers can be distinguished by their poses. The bark of Amun is depicted in precise detail, its golden prow, its sacred cabin draped in linen, the carrying poles that rested on the shoulders of the priests. The reliefs are not merely decorative. They are documentary, a visual record of the most important ceremony in Egyptian religion, preserved on the walls of the temple where it took place. And the temple itself, the physical structure of Luxor Temple, was designed around this ceremony. Every room, every corridor, every courtyard was positioned to serve a specific function within the Opet ritual. The approach from the north, through the first pylon into the court of Ramesses II, was the public face of the temple, accessible to larger numbers of people. The colonnade beyond, the magnificent processional avenue of 14 papyrus columns, each 16 meters tall, built by Amenhotep III, was the ceremonial corridor through which the bark was carried. The court of Amenhotep III, a vast peristyle hall surrounded by double rows of elegant papyrus columns, was the gathering space where the rituals of renewal began. And the inner chambers, the vestibule, the bark shrine, the birth room, were the most sacred spaces, accessible only to the high priest and the king. The construction of Luxor Temple reflects this liturgical program with architectural precision. Amenhotep III, who ruled from roughly 1390 to 1352 BC, was the primary builder. His architect, possibly the same Amenhotep son of Hapu, who designed many of the king's other monuments, created a temple of extraordinary elegance. The proportions are harmonious. The columns are slender and graceful, shaped like bundles of papyrus stalks with open flower capitals. The spaces are generous but not overwhelming. Unlike Karnak, which intimidates through sheer mass, Luxor Temple works through refinement. The stone is warm Nubian sandstone, quarried from Gebel el-Silsila and transported by barge down the Nile. The colour, a golden honey in daylight, a deep amber at sunset, gives the temple an intimacy that Karnak's grey limestone does not possess. Amenhotep III's temple comprised the inner sanctuary, the bark shrine, the birth room, the peristyle court, and the beginnings of the great colonnade. The colonnade was left undecorated at his death and was completed over the following decades by Tutankhamun, who added the Opet festival reliefs, and by Horemheb, who usurped Tutankhamun's cartouches and replaced them with his own. this sequence of construction and usurpation. Amenhotep building, Tutankhamun decorating, Horemheb claiming credit, is visible on the walls of the colonnade today. The layering of names tells a story of dynastic competition that is as revealing as the reliefs themselves. Roughly a century and a half after Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, added the structures that now form the temple's most recognizable features. Ramesses built the first pylon, the massive entrance gateway, 65 meters wide and 24 meters high, decorated with scenes of the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. He added the forecourt, a large open space surrounded by a double colonnade, its walls covered with reliefs, showing the king making offerings to the gods. And he placed before the pylon 6 colossal statues of himself, 4 seated, 2 standing, along with 2 red granite obelisks, each roughly 25 meters tall. One of those obelisks is no longer at Luxor. In 1831, the Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, presented the Western obelisk to King Louis Philippe of France as a diplomatic gift. The obelisk was transported to Paris, erected in the Place de la Concorde in 1836, and stands there today. A 3,000-year-old Egyptian needle in the center of a French traffic circle, gilded at the tip in 1998, seen by millions of people who have no idea that it once stood at the entrance to the Sacred Heart of Thebes. The eastern obelisk remains at Luxor, still in its original position, still flanking the entrance to the temple. The pair has been separated for nearly 2 centuries. One watches the Seine, the other watches the Nile. The first pylon of Ramesses created a new entrance to the temple, one that was not aligned with the older Amenhotep structures behind it. The axis of Ramesses' forecourt is slightly skewed relative to the axis of the colonnade and the inner temple. This misalignment has puzzled visitors and scholars for centuries. The most likely explanation is pragmatic. The alignment of Ramesses' pylon was dictated not by the older temple, but by the avenue of sphinxes, which approached from the northwest on a line determined by the geography of the route from Karnak. Ramesses chose to align his entrance with the processional road rather than with the building behind it. The result is a subtle but visible bend in the temple's plan. A kink in the axis that records, in architecture, the tension between the old temple and the new approach. Ramesses' forecourt also contains one of the most remarkable archaeological features of the site. The Mosque of Abu, the 13th century Islamic shrine that sits on top of the temple's eastern colonnade. When Ramesses' court was excavated in the 19th century, the excavators discovered that the mosque was built on a platform of accumulated debris, centuries of sand, silt, and rubble that had buried the temple to a depth of several meters. The mosque's builders had not known they were building on top of an ancient temple. They had built on the ground level of their own era, which happened to be several meters above the ground level of Ramesses' era. When the temple was excavated and the debris removed, the mosque was left stranded, perched on its platform, its foundation now exposed, its entrance now accessible only by a staircase that descends from the modern street level to the ancient floor. The mosque remains active. It is one of the holiest sites in Luxor. The annual Moulid festival of Abu al-Haggag, a celebration honoring the local Muslim saint, includes processions, boats carried through the streets, and celebrations that bear an uncanny resemblance to the ancient Opet festival processions depicted on the temple's own walls. The parallel is not accidental. Some scholars have suggested that the Moulid festival is a direct descendant of the Opet, that the tradition of carrying sacred vessels through the streets of Luxor has continued, in modified form, for more than 3,000 years, passing from pharaonic to Roman to Christian to Islamic practice without interruption. The boats have changed, the gods have changed, the route has shortened, but the act, the public procession of secret objects through the streets of Thebes, accompanied by music and celebration, has endured. This is the uniqueness of Luxor Temple. It is not merely an archaeological site. It is a living site, a place where the past and the present coexist, not as metaphor but as physical fact. The mosque sits on the temple sits on the bedrock, and the worship continues. Different in form, identical in location, unbroken in practice. The Sacred Heart of Thebes still beats. The Opet festival was not merely a religious event. It was the political engine of the new kingdom state. The festival legitimized the king, but it also legitimized the priesthood that organized it, the military that escorted it, the bureaucracy that funded it, and the entire social order that participated in it. The festival was a demonstration, a public spectacle of state power, conducted under divine auspices, witnessed by the entire population of Thebes. To attend the Opet was to participate in the renewal of the cosmic order. To miss it was to stand outside the community of the blessed. The economic dimensions of the festival were enormous. The Papyrus Harris records the provisions allocated for the Opet under Ramesses III. Thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of beer and wine, dozens of cattle and geese, baskets of fruit, bolts of linen, and quantities of incense and perfume. These provisions were distributed to the populace during the festival, a massive act of state-sponsored generosity that reinforced the social contract between ruler and ruled. The king provided, the people celebrated, the god approved, and the cycle continued. The route of the procession was itself significant. In the earliest periods of the Opet festival, the bark of Amun was carried overland, through the streets of Thebes, along the Avenue of Sphinxes, from Karnak to Luxor Temple. Later, the route was moved to the river. The bark was placed on a real boat and sailed downstream on the Nile, accompanied by a flotilla of ceremonial vessels. The change in route may reflect the growing importance of the festival. A river procession was more visible, more dramatic, and more expensive than an overland march. It was also more vulnerable to disruption. Wind, current, and the unpredictability of the river made the journey hazardous. But the hazard was part of the point. The king risked the Nile because the Nile was divine. The journey was not merely practical, it was sacramental. The colonnade reliefs at Luxor Temple depict both modes of transport, the overland procession and the river journey. On the western wall, the outward journey from Karnak to Luxor is shown. The barks of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu are carried on the shoulders of priests, flanked by musicians and dancers. On the eastern wall, the return journey is depicted. The barks are placed on boats and towed upstream by teams of men hauling ropes from the riverbank. The two walls tell the same story in two different modes of transport, a comprehensive documentary record of a ceremony that lasted for weeks and involved thousands of participants. The reliefs were begun by Tutankhamun, the boy king who restored the worship of Amun after the Atenist heresy of his predecessor Akhenaten. Tutankhamun had come to the throne as a child, in circumstances that remain unclear, and his first act as king was to reverse Akhenaten revolution, to reopen the temples of Amun, to restore the priesthood, and to resume the festivals that had been suspended during the heretical period. The Opet festival reliefs at Luxor Temple were part of this restoration program, a visual declaration that the old order had been re-established, that the gods were once again receiving their due, that the cosmic balance had been restored. But Tutankhamun died young, at roughly 19 years of age, and his name was later erased from the colonnade walls by Horemheb, the general who eventually succeeded him. Horemheb replaced Tutankhamun cartouches with his own, claiming credit for the reliefs, and, by extension, for the restoration of the Amun cult. This act of usurpation, a common practice in Egyptian history, means that the Opet festival reliefs at Luxor bear the wrong name. The art is Tutankhamun, the name is Haheb, the credit is misplaced, and the misplacement has lasted for more than 3,000 years. This is one of the small ironies of Luxor Temple. A building devoted to the legitimization of royal authority contains, on its own walls, evidence of the illegitimacy of that authority. Horemheb stole Tutankhamun reliefs. Ramesses II placed his cartouches on statues carved by Amenhotep III. Alexander the Great rebuilt the sanctuary in his own name, while claiming to be the successor of kings who had been dead for 1,000 years. Each act of appropriation was an act of political manipulation. The use of sacred architecture to construct a narrative of power that the facts did not support. And yet the architecture absorbs these manipulations without being diminished by them. The colonnade is still magnificent. The court of Amenhotep III is still beautiful. The birthroom reliefs are still theologically profound. The individual acts of usurpation and appropriation are footnotes, interesting to scholars, invisible to most visitors. The temple transcends the politics that built it. The sacred space outlasts the political claims that were made within it, and the visitor, standing in the peristyle court at sunset, does not feel the presence of Ramesses or Horemheb or Alexander. The visitor feels the presence of the space, the proportions, the light, the stone, the silence, the architecture, the sacred. This is what Amenhotep III architect understood. He understood that architecture outlasts politics, that proportions outlast propaganda, that the experience of a well-made space endures longer than the name of the person who commissioned it. The architect, possibly Amenhotep son of Hapu, later deified for his accomplishments, created a building that has been admired, used, worshipped in, and fought over for 34 centuries. His name is remembered, but his real achievement is not his name. It is the building, the space, the proportions, the columns rising in the golden light of the Theban sunset, casting shadows that have been cast in the same pattern, at the same angle, at the same time of day, for 3,400 years. The shadows are the same, the light is the same, the stone is the same, only the people change. And the people, pharaohs, priests, soldiers, pilgrims, tourists, come and go with the centuries, each generation leaving its mark, each mark adding to the palimpsest, each layer deepening the mystery of why this place, this ground, this specific arrangement of columns and courts and sanctuaries, has never stopped being sacred. The answer may be simpler than we think. Luxor Temple is sacred because it is beautiful, because the proportions are right, because the columns catch the light in a way that makes the human heart respond, because the progression from court to colonnade to sanctuary creates an experience of deepening intimacy that mirrors the human experience of approaching the divine, because the architects got it right, not just the theology, not just the politics, not just the engineering, but the art, the architecture, the space. And the space once created generates its own sacredness. It does not need a god to be holy. It does not need a priest to be sacred. It needs only to be, to stand, to catch the light, to cast its shadows, to receive the visitor who enters and feels, without knowing why, that they are in a place that matters, that they are in the presence of something larger than themselves, that the ground beneath their feet has been holy for a very long time, and will be holy for a very long time to come. The core problem of Luxor Temple is the problem of sacred persistence. Why does holiness stick to certain places? Why do different religions, across different centuries, choose the same ground? And what does this persistence tell us about the nature of the sacred itself? The conventional archaeological answer is pragmatic. Sacred sites persist because they occupy geographically significant locations: hilltops, river crossings, springs, prominent natural features. Luxor Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile, at a point where the river curves gently, creating a broad, fertile floodplain that has supported intensive agriculture for millennia. The site is elevated slightly above the surrounding terrain, high enough to be visible, low enough to be accessible. It faces the river. It catches the morning sun. It occupies a natural gathering point in the landscape. These physical features, the pragmatist argues, are sufficient to explain why the site was chosen. First for an Egyptian temple, then for a Roman fort, then for a church, then for a mosque. Each new occupant chose the site, not because it was sacred, but because it was convenient. But this explanation, while partially correct, is insufficient. There were many convenient sites along the Nile, many elevated locations, many points where the river curved and the floodplain widened. The entire east bank of ancient Thebes was dotted with potential temple sites. And yet Luxor Temple, this specific site, this specific ground, was the one that every subsequent culture chose to occupy. The pragmatic explanation accounts for the initial selection. It does not account for the persistence. The theological explanation goes deeper. In Egyptian cosmology, certain places were inherently sacred, charged with divine energy by virtue of their position in the cosmic landscape. The east bank of the Nile was the land of the living, the side where the sun rose, where cities were built, where temples to the living gods were constructed. The west bank was the land of the dead, the side where the sun set, where tombs were carved, where mortuary temples served the deceased. Luxor Temple, on the east bank, was aligned with the living god, Amun-Ra, in his most vital, most regenerative aspect. The site was sacred, not because of what was built on it, but because of where it stood in the cosmic order, and the birth room of Amenhotep III, the small chamber deep within the temple, whose walls depict the divine conception, gestation, and birth of the pharaoh, suggests that Luxor Temple was understood as a place of creation. The reliefs show Amun visiting Queen Mutemwia, the king's mother, in the guise of her husband Thutmose IV. The god places the ankh, the symbol of life, to the queen's nostrils. The inscription states that his dew filled her body. The creator god Kuknum then fashions the infant Amenhotep and his car on a potter's wheel. The goddesses Hathor and Mut attend the birth. The newborn king is presented to Amun, who recognizes him as his son. This narrative is not unique to Luxor Temple. A similar birth cycle appears in Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, but its placement at Luxor is significant. The birth room is located at the very heart of the temple, the innermost chamber, the most sacred space. Its presence suggests that Luxor Temple was understood not merely as a place where the king was renewed, but as a place where the king was born, where the divine essence of kingship entered the physical world, where the cosmic and the human merged, where the pharaoh's divine nature was not merely confirmed but created. If Luxor Temple was a place of divine creation, a place where the king was born as a god, then the Opet festival was not merely an annual renewal, it was an annual rebirth. Each year the king returned to the place of his divine birth and re-experienced the moment of his creation. The merger with the royal car was not a metaphorical recharging. It was a literal recreation, a return to the moment of origin, a reenactment of the first birth, a restoration of the king to his original divine condition. The Opet festival was a time machine, a liturgical device for returning the king annually to the moment of his creation. This interpretation explains why Luxor Temple was so important, more important, in ceremonial terms than Karnak itself. Karnak was the house of Amun. Luxor was the house of creation. Karnak was where Amun ruled. Luxor was where Amun generated. The two temples were complementary, one political, one generative, one public, one intimate. And the Opet festival, which linked them through the annual procession, was the ritual that kept the cosmic cycle turning, that ensured the king was renewed, the god was satisfied, and the universe remained in order. But here's the problem. The Opet festival required Luxor Temple. Without the temple, there was no venue for the renewal ritual. Without the ritual, there was no renewal. Without the renewal, the king's divine authority lapsed. The entire legitimacy of the Egyptian state, the claim that the pharaoh was a living god, that his rule was endorsed by the cosmic order, that his power derived not from military force or popular support, but from divine mandate, depended on a single ceremony performed in a single temple once a year. The theological infrastructure of the Egyptian state rested on the sacred ground of Luxor, and it gets worse. The festival's importance grew over time. Under Ramesses III, the Opet festival lasted 24 days. By the end of his reign, it had been extended to 27 days. Each extension was an increase in the temple's political significance. More days of celebration meant more days of public expenditure, more days of state-sponsored feasting, more days of priestly employment. The festival was an economic engine, as well as a theological one. It redistributed wealth from the temple treasuries to the population of Thebes. It demonstrated the king's generosity. It reinforced the social contract between ruler and ruled. And all of it, every feast, every procession, every chanted hymn, centered on Luxor Temple. The dependency was mutual. The temple needed the festival to justify its existence. The festival needed the temple to provide its setting. The king needed both to maintain his legitimacy. And the priesthood, the administrative class that managed the temple, organized the festival, and mediated between the king and the god, needed all three to maintain its own power. The result was a self-reinforcing system, a feedback loop in which temple, festival, king, and priesthood were so deeply intertwined that removing any one of them would have destabilized the others. This is what makes the eventual abandonment of Luxor Temple so significant. When the system finally failed, when the Roman emperor closed the temples, when the priesthood was dissolved, when the Opet festival ceased, The entire theological infrastructure of the Egyptian state collapsed. Not gradually, not partially, completely. The king lost his divine mandate, the priesthood lost its institutional base, the festival lost its venue, and the temple lost its purpose. And yet the sacredness persisted. The Romans, who had no use for Amun-Ra, built a fortress around the temple and painted their own religious frescoes. Images of Roman emperors in the pose of divine rulers over the pharaonic reliefs. The Christians, who had no use for either Amun-Ra or the Roman emperor cult, built a church inside the temple courtyard, converting pagan sacred space into Christian sacred space. And the Muslims, who had no use for either Amun-Ra or Christian liturgy, built a mosque on top of the Christian church, converting Christian sacred space into Islamic sacred space. Each conversion was a repudiation of the previous religion, and each conversion was a confirmation of the site's sacredness. The new faith rejected the old God, but kept the old ground. The theology changed, the location did not, and the persistence of the location, through 4 religions, across 34 centuries, suggests that the sacredness of Luxor Temple was not merely theological, it was geographical, topographical, geological. Something about this place, something that transcended any individual religion, made it holy, and every culture that encountered it recognized that holiness, even as they rejected the specific God who was supposed to reside there. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between religion and sacred space. We assume that sacred spaces are created by religions, that a place becomes holy because a religion declares it so. Luxor Temple suggests the opposite, that some places are holy first, and that religions subsequently attach themselves to them. The sacredness is not in the god. The sacredness is in the ground, and the ground, unlike the god, does not change when the religion changes. This is a radical idea. It implies that sacredness is a property of geography, not of theology, that certain locations possess a quality that human beings, across every era and every culture, consistently interpret as sacred. The quality may be physical, the orientation of the site, the quality of the light, the acoustic properties of the space, the presence of water, or it may be social, the accumulated weight of centuries of worship, the cultural memory of previous sacredness, the simple fact that people have always worshipped here. Whatever the cause, the effect is consistent. Luxor Temple has been holy for 3,400 years, under 4 different religions, and shows no sign of becoming less holy anytime soon. The Abu al-Haggag Mosque is the living proof. Built in the 13th century, dedicated to a local Sufi saint, active and thriving in the 21st century, it sits on top of a pharaonic temple that was built to house the divine essence of Egyptian kingship. The mosque's worshippers are not worshipping Amun-Ra. They are not worshipping the royal Ka. They are worshipping Allah through the intercession of a medieval saint in a building that happens to occupy the most sacred ground in ancient Thebes. The religion has changed, the sacredness has not, and the Moulid festival, the annual celebration of Abu al-Haggag, enacts a ritual that is, structurally, identical to the Ipet festival. Sacred objects are carried through the streets, the population gathers to celebrate, music is played, food is distributed. The community reaffirms its connection to the divine through a public spectacle of devotion. The boats that are carried through the streets of modern Luxor during the Moulid are not the golden barks of Amun, but they are boats carried by hand through the streets of the same city, on the same route, 3,000 years after the original procession. Let that sink in. The Ipet festival may be the oldest continuously practiced religious ritual in human history, not as a self-conscious revival, not as an archaeological reenactment, but as a living tradition that has been passed from generation to generation, from religion to religion, modified in form but preserved in structure, for more than 30 centuries. The procession continues. The boats are carried, the sacred ground is honoured, and the people of Luxor, Muslim worshippers in the 21st century, are the inheritors of a tradition that began in the 14th century BC, in the reign of Amenhotep III, in the sacred heart of Thebes. This is not science fiction. This is anthropology. This is the documented, observable, verifiable persistence of a ritual tradition across 3 millennia and 4 religions, and the temple that anchors that tradition. Luxor Temple, the southern sanctuary, the birthplace of the royal Ka, is the building that made it possible. The question of who first recognized the holiness of this specific site predates the temple itself. The earliest known reference to Luxor Temple appears on a pair of stelae from the reign of Ahmose I, dating to roughly 1550 BC, the founder of the 18th dynasty, and the pharaoh who expelled the Hyksos invaders and reunified Egypt. The stelae, found at the Masra limestone quarry east of Memphis, record the excavation of stone for several temples, including one described as the Mansion of Amun in the southern sanctuary. This reference tells us that the site was already designated as sacred, already associated with Amun, already considered a sanctuary at the very beginning of the New Kingdom, before Amenhotep III began his grand construction. The earliest surviving physical structures at the site date to the reign of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Roughly a century before Amenhotep III, Hatshepsut built a small shrine, a bark station, designed as a resting point for the sacred bark of Amun during the Ipet procession, that was later dismantled and its blocks reused. Thutmose III may have added to the shrine, but the structures were modest, way stations, not temples. The grand temple that we see today is overwhelmingly the work of Amenhotep III, with the crucial additions of Ramesses II. Amenhotep III was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history. His reign, roughly 38 years of peace and prosperity, was marked by an extraordinary program of monumental construction. He built the Luxor Temple, much of the Karnak precinct, the mortuary temple on the west bank that once stood behind the Colossi of Memnon, and a palace complex at Malkata, south of the Valley of the Kings. His architect, Amenhotep son of Hapu, was so revered that he was deified after death, an honor reserved for only a handful of non-royal Egyptians. The man who designed Luxor Temple became a god. The design itself is a masterpiece of proportion. Unlike Karnak, which grew organically over centuries, Luxor Temple was built to a single plan, or very nearly so. Amenhotep III's original temple comprises the inner sanctuary, the bark shrine, a vestibule, a hypostyle hall with 32 columns, the great peristyle court with its double rows of papyrus columns, and the processional colonnade. The proportions are classical. The columns are tall and slender. The spaces are rhythmic and balanced. The decoration is refined rather than bombastic. If Karnak is opera, Luxor is chamber music. The scale is smaller, the effect is more intimate, and the architectural quality, the precision of the column carving, the elegance of the floral capitals, the harmony of the spatial relationships, is, by many scholars' assessment, the finest in Egypt. The peristyle court of Amenhotep III is the emotional center of the temple. Surrounded by double rows of clustered papyrus columns with closed bud capitals, the court creates a space that is simultaneously enclosed and open, bounded by stone on all four sides, but open to the sky above. The columns cast long shadows across the stone floor. The light changes through the day, harsh and white at noon, warm and golden at sunset, theatrical and dramatic when the temple is floodlit at night. Modern visitors who arrive in the evening, when the temple is illuminated against the dark sky, often describe the experience as one of the most atmospheric in Egypt. The ancient builders designed for sunlight. The modern lighting designers have added a different beauty. But the bones of the architecture, the proportions and rhythms that Amenhotep III established 34 centuries ago, are what make the space work. Beyond the court, the temple narrows into the processional colonnade. Amenhotep III's great contribution to Egyptian architecture. 7 pairs of papyrus columns with open flower capitals, each 16 meters tall, support massive stone architraves that still span the gap between them. The colonnade is a corridor, a directed space, designed to guide movement along the axis from the entrance to the sanctuary. Walking through it, with the towering columns rising on either side, and the sky visible in a narrow strip above, the visitor is channeled, funneled, directed inward, toward the darkness, toward the sanctuary, toward the god. The walls of the colonnade bear the famous Opet festival reliefs, the most complete visual record of the ceremony that defined Luxor Temple purpose. The reliefs, begun by Tutankhamun and completed by Horemheb and Seti I, depict every stage of the festival procession. On the western wall, the outward journey, from Karnak to Luxor is shown. On the eastern wall, the return journey. The reliefs are read like a comic strip, sequential panels, each depicting a moment in the procession, arranged in chronological order along the wall. The golden barks of Amun, Mut and Khonsu are shown being carried by priests. Musicians play, dancers leap, soldiers march. Citizens watch from the banks of the river and the rooftops of houses. Bulls are led to slaughter, offerings are presented, and the king, Tutankhamun originally, but his name was later replaced by Horem-Heb, presides over the entire spectacle, the living link between the human population and the divine procession. These reliefs are among the most valuable historical documents from the New Kingdom. They provide detailed information about the organization of the festival, the costumes of the participants, the instruments of the musicians, the breeds of the sacrificial animals, and the structure of the processional route. They also provide one of the few visual records of the boats and barges that were used on the Nile, information that is relevant not only to Egyptology, but to the history of naval architecture. The reliefs are not art for art's sake. They are documentary art, created with the explicit purpose of recording a real event in real detail for permanent preservation. And the architectural evidence for this persistence is carved into the walls of the temple itself. In the innermost chambers of Luxor Temple, the rooms behind the bark shrine, the spaces that were once the most sacred in the entire complex, Roman soldiers plastered over the pharaonic reliefs and painted their own images. These Roman frescoes, dating to roughly the 3rd century of the Common Era, show 4 figures in Roman military dress, possibly the 4 co-emperors of the Tetrarchy: Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius. The figures stand in poses that echo the pharaonic tradition, offering to the divine, claiming divine sanction, asserting their legitimacy through the visual vocabulary of sacred art. The Roman painters did not know they were painting over images of Amenhotep III. They did not know they were standing in the birthroom of a pharaoh, but they knew they were in a sacred space, and they used that space to legitimize their own power, just as Amenhotep had done 17 centuries earlier. Today, the Roman frescoes and the pharaonic reliefs are both visible. In places where the Roman plaster has fallen away, the older Egyptian images emerge from beneath, creating a palimpsest of overlapping sacred art. Roman emperors and Egyptian gods share the same wall. Christian crosses and pharaonic cartouches coexist on the same surface. The temple is a layered document, each layer a different religion, each religion claiming the same ground, each ground speaking in a different visual language, but saying the same thing: this place is holy. I am its rightful custodian. The Christian layer is less visible but equally significant. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the temple was adapted for Christian use. A church was constructed in the court of Amenhotep III, its apes carved into the pharaonic walls, its altars positioned where the Egyptian offering tables had once stood. Coptic crosses were scratched into the columns. Pharaonic reliefs were defaced. The faces of the gods were chipped away to prevent them from becoming objects of pagan worship. The conversion was not gentle, it was ideological. The new faith required the visible destruction of the old, and yet the destruction was selective. The Christians defaced the faces but left the bodies. They scratched crosses but did not demolish walls. They built their church inside the temple but did not tear the temple down. The Egyptian structure was too massive, too useful, too well built to destroy. It was easier to convert than to demolish, and so the temple survived, altered, damaged, defaced, but structurally intact, to be converted again, this time by Islam, in the 13th century. The Abu al-Haggag Mosque, built atop the filled-in temple court, completed the sequence. Egyptian, Roman, Christian, Islamic. 4 religions, 1 building, 34 centuries. Each layer is visible, each layer tells a story. And the building that contains all of them, Luxor Temple, the southern sanctuary, the birthplace of the royal Ka, holds them all in its sandstone walls with an equanimity that no individual religion could match. This is what makes Luxor Temple unique among the monuments of the ancient world. It is not a ruin, it is not a museum, it is not an archaeological site preserved under glass. It is a living building, older than recorded history, active to this day, inhabited by a faith that is the fourth in a sequence stretching back to the beginning of Egyptian civilization. The stones remember, the ground remembers, and the people who worship there, kneeling on prayer rugs above the columns of Amenhotep III, are, whether they know it or not, the latest in a line of worshippers that has been unbroken for 3,400 years. The modern discovery and excavation of Luxor Temple is itself a remarkable story, a story of gradual revelation, as the temple was slowly freed from the centuries of debris that had buried it. When Napoleon expedition arrived at Luxor in 1799, the temple was almost entirely buried. Only the upper portions of the columns and the tops of the colossal statues were visible above the ground level of the medieval and Ottoman town that had grown up around and within the temple compound. Houses, shops, and mosques were built atop the ancient ruins. The Mosque of Abu al-Haggag sat on a platform of debris several meters above the pharaonic floor. The avenue of sphinxes was completely invisible, buried under streets, buildings, and centuries of accumulated silt. The first systematic excavation began in 1884 under Gaston Maspero, the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. Maspero cleared the court of Ramesses II and the processional colonnade, revealing the Opet festival reliefs that had been hidden for centuries. The excavation required the demolition of houses and the relocation of residents, a process that was controversial even in the 19th century, and that foreshadowed the much larger displacement that would accompany the 21st century restoration of the Avenue of Sphinxes. Maspero was followed by a succession of excavators and restorers. The French Egyptologist Georges de Ressy worked at the temple in the 1890s. The Egyptian archaeologist Mohammed Mahmoud continued the excavation into the early 20th century, and the Epigraphic Survey of the Oriental Institute of Chicago, led for many years by the legendary epigrapher Harold Nelson and later by other distinguished scholars, conducted the most detailed recording of the temple reliefs ever undertaken. Their publication, a multi-volume series titled Medinet Habu and Reliefs and Inscriptions at Luxor Temple, remains the standard reference for scholars working on the temple today. The recording work of the Epigraphic Survey is a monument in itself. Each relief is drawn at full scale by trained artists using a method called the Chicago House Method, a painstaking process in which a preliminary photograph is enlarged to the size of the original relief. The artist traces the outlines of the carved figures on the photograph. The tracing is checked against the original by the artist, and a second epigrapher. Corrections are made, and the final drawing is prepared for publication. The process takes hours for a single relief panel. The entire temple contains thousands of panels. The recording has been ongoing for decades and is still not complete. This level of documentation is crucial because the reliefs are deteriorating. The sandstone from which Luxor Temple is built is subject to the same forces of salt weathering, groundwater damage, and air pollution that affect every ancient monument in the Nile Valley. The rising water table, exacerbated by irrigation and the regulation of the river by the Aswan High Dam, draws moisture upward through the foundations of the temple, carrying dissolved salts that crystallize on the carved surfaces and cause the sandstone to flake and crumble. The process is slow but relentless. Each year, the reliefs lose a fraction of their original detail. Each year, the record becomes slightly less complete. The Chicago House Method preserves, in ink on paper, information that is being lost from the stone. The published drawings are, in effect, a parallel archive, a secondary record that will survive the deterioration of the primary one. When the sandstone finally crumbles beyond recognition, as it eventually will, given enough time, the drawings will remain. They will be the last record of what the priests of Amun carved on the walls of their most sacred temple. They will be the memory that the stone can no longer hold. And this is perhaps the final irony of Luxor Temple's story. A building that was designed to be eternal, built from stone, oriented toward the cosmos, consecrated by the king of the gods, is being preserved, in the 21st century, by ink on paper, the most permanent material the ancient world could produce. Sandstone, laid in courses, carved with divine images, sanctified by millennia of worship, is being outlasted by the most ephemeral medium the modern world can produce: drawings on acid-free paper, stored in climate-controlled archives. published in limited edition volumes that are themselves vulnerable to fire, flood, and institutional neglect. The stone was supposed to last forever. The paper is supposed to last a few centuries, and yet the paper may prove more durable than the stone, because the paper is cared for, maintained, and replicated, while the stone is exposed to forces that no conservation program can ultimately defeat. The ancient builders trusted stone, the modern conservators trust documentation, and the competition between the two, between the permanence of stone and the reproducibility of information, is the defining contest of heritage conservation in the modern world. At Luxor Temple, the contest is ongoing. The stone deteriorates, the documentation accumulates, and the temple, caught between the two, continues to do what it has always done: to stand on its sacred ground, to face the Nile, to catch the light at sunset, and to wait. It has been waiting for 34 centuries. It will continue to wait for the next conservator, the next archaeologist, the next worshipper, the next visitor who walks through the first pylon and feels, for the first time, the weight and the beauty and the silence of the Sacred Heart of Thebes. And the Opet festival itself, the ceremony that defined Luxor Temple purpose, evolved dramatically over the centuries. Under Hatshepsut and Thutmose III in the 15th century BC, the festival lasted 11 days. Under Rameses II in the 13th century BC, it lasted for more than 3 weeks. Under Ramesses III in the 12th century BC, it lasted 24 days and then was extended to 27. Each extension was a political statement. A longer festival meant more public expenditure, more state-sponsored feasting, more visible demonstrations of royal generosity. The festival was a popular event. The people of Thebes looked forward to it. The distribution of bread, beer, meat, and wine was a genuine redistribution of wealth from the temple treasuries to the urban poor. And the extension of the festival from 11 days to 27 represents a 200% increase in public spending over the course of 3 centuries. The direction of the procession also changed. In the earliest versions of the festival, the bark of Amun travelled overland, carried on the shoulders of priests along the avenue of sphinxes from Karnak to Luxor. In later versions, the bark was placed on a riverboat and sailed downstream on the Nile, accompanied by a flotilla of royal and priestly vessels. The change in transportation mode reflected the growing importance of the river procession as a public spectacle. The river route was more visible, more accessible to spectators, and more dramatic than the overland route. The return journey from Luxor back to Karnak was typically made overland regardless of the outward mode, since the current of the Nile would have made an upstream river journey impractical. The 6 bark stations along the Avenue of Sphinxes, small way stations where the procession could pause and the bearers could rest, were rediscovered during the 21st century restoration of the avenue. These stations, each consisting of a small stone platform with niches for the bark, provided regular resting points along the 3-kilometer route. They were spaced at intervals of roughly 500 meters, a distance that corresponds to the maximum comfortable carrying distance for a heavy bark borne on the shoulders of priests. The spacing tells us something about the physical demands of the procession. The weight of the golden bark, the endurance of the bearers, the pace of the march. The theology was grand, the logistics were mundane, and the bark stations are the archaeological evidence for the point where theology met logistics, the place where the divine procession paused, not for a theological reason, but because the priests' shoulders ached. The recent discovery of these stations, and of the full extent of the Avenue of Sphinxes itself, has transformed our understanding of the processional landscape of ancient Thebes. The avenue was not a simple road. It was a choreographed ceremonial space, a linear temple stretching for nearly 3 kilometers, designed to frame and direct the most important religious procession in the Egyptian calendar. The sphinxes that lined the avenue were not decorative. They were guardians, sacred sentinels, watching the procession pass, protecting the bark from malicious forces, ensuring the safe passage of the god from his public residence at Karnak to his private chambers at Luxor. The restoration of the avenue, completed in 2021, was the largest urban archaeological project in Egyptian history. more than 1,000 modern buildings were surveyed, documented, and, where necessary, relocated to clear the ancient route. The project took decades and cost hundreds of millions of Egyptian pounds. The result is extraordinary: a restored processional avenue, lined with hundreds of sphinxes, connecting two of the greatest temples in the ancient world, walkable for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. And the walk itself, the 3-kilometer journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple, along the restored avenue, past the sphinxes and the bark stations, through the heart of ancient Thebes, is an experience that no other archaeological site in the world can offer. The visitor is not merely looking at the past. The visitor is walking through it, physically retracing the route of the Ipet procession, covering the same ground that the priests of Amun covered 3,000 years ago, arriving at the same destination that the golden bark of the god arrived at every year during the season of inundation. The walk takes roughly 45 minutes at a comfortable pace. The ancient procession, with its pauses for rest, its musical accompaniment, its rituals at the bark stations, and its enormous entourage, probably took several hours. But the route is the same. The ground is the same. The sphinxes are the same. Or at least, they are reconstructed from the same stone, in the same positions, with the same faces, staring inward, watching the road, guarding the path that connects the public and the private, the cosmic and the intimate, Karnak and Luxor, the king of the gods and the sacred heart of Thebes. Take the temple room by room. Walk through it as the priests walked through it. From the public entrance to the private sanctuary, from light to darkness, from the human world to the divine, begin at the Avenue of Sphinxes. The approach from Karnak, nearly 3 kilometers of ceremonial road, lined with sphinxes, connecting the two great temples of Thebes, was the beginning of the sacred journey. The avenue was not merely a road. It was a liturgical space, a processional corridor through which the bark of Amun travelled during the Opet festival, stopping at way stations along the route for rest and ritual. The avenue was lined with sphinxes, ram-headed sphinxes in some sections, human-headed sphinxes in others, each one a guardian of the sacred path, each one facing inward, toward the road, watching the procession pass. The restoration of the avenue, completed in 2021 after decades of excavation and reconstruction, required the relocation of hundreds of modern buildings, including homes, shops, and a church. The project was controversial. Residents were displaced, communities were disrupted, and the cost was enormous. But the result is extraordinary. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the full processional route from Karnak to Luxor Temple is walkable. A 3-kilometer journey through time, from the first pylon of Karnak to the first pylon of Luxor, through the heart of ancient Thebes. Now arrive at the first pylon, Ramesses II's gateway, 65 meters wide, originally about 24 meters high, though the upper courses have largely collapsed. The pylon face is covered with reliefs depicting the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II's great military confrontation with the Hittites, fought around 1274 BC in what is now Syria. The battle, which was probably a strategic draw, is presented on the pylon as an overwhelming Egyptian victory. Ramesses is shown single-handedly routing the Hittite chariot corps, his figure towering over the battlefield, his bow drawn, his enemies falling beneath his wheels. The propaganda is shameless. But the art is magnificent, dynamic, detailed, and carved with a confidence that reflects the reign of a pharaoh who had no use for understatement. Flanking the pylon, the surviving colossal statues of Ramesses, two seated figures, each roughly 15 meters tall, stare forward with the calm, idealized expression of divine kingship. Their scale is meant to overwhelm. Standing before them, a human being is reduced to insignificance, a deliberate theological statement about the relationship between the mortal visitor and the divine king. The eastern obelisk, still in its original position, rises beside the statues, 25 meters of red Aswan granite, its hieroglyphic inscription praising Ramesses as the beloved of Amun, its tip once gilded to catch the first rays of the morning sun. Pass through the pylon and enter the court of Ramesses II. This is the space where the ancient and the modern coexist most dramatically. To the left, the double colonnade of the court rises in 2 tiers of papyrus columns. To the right, perched on its accumulated platform of debris, The Mosque of Abu al-Haggag surveys the scene from above. Its whitewashed walls and minaret a striking contrast to the honey-coloured sandstone below. The court was designed as a gathering space, open to the sky, surrounded by columns, large enough to accommodate the crowds who witnessed the arrival of the sacred bark during the Ipet festival. The walls of the court are covered with reliefs showing Ramesses making offerings to the Theban triad Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. The reliefs are in sunk relief, deeply carved into the stone surface, creating shadows that make the figures visible even in bright sunlight. This technique, favoured by Ramesses, was both aesthetic and practical. Sunk relief is more durable than raised relief, less vulnerable to weathering and less susceptible to usurpation, since the figures cannot be easily recarved without leaving visible scars. Ramesses, who was himself a notorious usurper of his predecessors' monuments, chose a technique that made his own work harder to steal. Continue south through the gateway and enter the processional colonnade. The transition is immediate and dramatic. The open court gives way to a narrow, enclosed corridor defined by 14 massive papyrus columns, each 16 meters tall, with open flower capitals that spread like stone blossoms above. The space is directional. It pulls you forward, toward the interior, toward the sanctuary. The columns create a rhythm, light shadow, that accelerates as you move deeper into the temple. The walls bear the Ipet festival reliefs, the detailed visual record of the procession that defined the temple purpose. Here, carved in stone, is the entire spectacle, the barks being carried, the musicians playing, the dancers leaping, soldiersjans marching, the crowds cheering, the bulls being slaughtered, the offerings being presented. The colonnade is not merely a corridor, it is a documentary, a 3,000-year-old film of the most important ceremony in Egyptian religion, frozen in stone, frame by frame, on the walls of the building where it took place. Beyond the colonnade, enter the peristyle court of Amenhotep III. This is the architectural heart of the temple, and many visitors consider it the most beautiful space in Egypt. The court is surrounded by a double row of clustered papyrus columns with closed bud capitals, elegant, slender, proportioned with a mathematical precision that gives the space a serenity that the more bombastic structures at Karnak cannot match. The columns are carved from a single type of Nubian sandstone, warm, golden, fine-grained, and their surfaces retain traces of the original painted decoration. The court was designed as a ceremonial gathering space, the setting for the rituals that preceded the entry of the bark into the inner sanctuary. It is large enough to accommodate hundreds of people, but intimate enough to feel enclosed. The sky is visible above. The columns define the edges. The floor, polished stone, worn smooth by 3 millennia of footsteps, reflects the light. The space is, in architectural terms, perfect, a synthesis of scale and intimacy, of grandeur and grace, that demonstrates why Amenhotep III is considered one of the greatest builder patrons in Egyptian history. Beyond the court, the space is narrow. The hypostyle hall, 32 columns, ranged in 4 rows, leads to the vestibule. The vestibule leads to the bark shrine, the room where the sacred bark of Amun was placed during the Ipet festival. And beyond the bark shrine lies the sanctuary, the innermost room, the holiest space, the room where the god resided. The sanctuary at Luxor Temple has a unique distinction. It was rebuilt by Alexander the Great. After conquering Egypt in 332 BC, Alexander presented himself to the Egyptians as a pharaoh, the son of Amun, the legitimate successor to the ancient kings. He rebuilt the bark shrine at Luxor Temple, replacing the original Amenhotep structure with a new one that bore his own name and titles, inscribed in traditional pharaonic style. The reliefs show Alexander in the full regalia of an Egyptian king, Neem's headdress, false beard, uraeus cobra, making offerings to Amun, a Greek conqueror depicted as an Egyptian pharaoh, in a temple built 14 centuries before his birth. The image is a perfect encapsulation of Luxor Temple's function, the legitimization of power through divine endorsement. And the birth room, the chamber of the divine birth located behind the sanctuary, contains the reliefs that are arguably the most theologically significant at Luxor. The west wall shows the complete narrative of Amenhotep III's divine conception and birth. Amun, disguised as Thutmose IV, visits Queen Mutamwia, The god Thoth leads Amun to the queen's bedchamber. Amun and the queen sit together on the hieroglyph for heaven, supported by the goddesses Selket and Neith. The god puts the breath of life to the queen's nostrils, and the inscription records that his dew filled her body. The creator god Khnum then fashions the infant Amenhotep and his car on his potter's wheel. The goddess Isis watches. The baby and his car are presented to Amun, who recognizes them as his own. The mother, Mutamwia, is attended by goddesses during the birth. The newborn king is suckled by divine wet nurses. And the cycle is complete. The human king has been revealed as the son of the god, born through divine intervention, legitimate by birth, divine by nature. These reliefs are not decoration. They are constitution, the legal and theological foundation of Amenhotep III's right to rule. In a civilization where kingship was divine, the proof of divinity was the proof of legitimacy, and the proof was carved, permanently and publicly, on the walls of the most sacred room in the most sacred temple in Thebes. The birth room is a constitutional document in stone, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a certificate of royal legitimacy, displayed in the very room where the legitimacy was annually renewed. The Roman transformation of Luxor Temple deserves more detailed attention because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the process by which sacred spaces are converted from one religion to another. When the Roman legions established a permanent garrison at Thebes in the 3rd century of the Common Era, they needed a fortress. Luxor Temple, with its massive stone walls, its enclosed courtyards, and its strategic position on the Nile, was a natural choice. The Romans did not demolish the temple, they adapted it. They filled in the lower levels of the pharaonic courts with rubble, raising the floor level by several meters. They built military structures, barracks, storerooms, watchtowers. Within and around the temple compound, they constructed gates in the enclosure walls and paved roads through the complex. The temple became a castrum, a Roman military camp, its ancient sacred spaces repurposed as quarters for soldiers and storage for military supplies. But the Romans did not merely use the temple as a fortress. They also used it as a religious space, not for the worship of Amun-Ra, which had long since been suppressed, but for the cult of the Roman emperor. In a small room off the main axis, a room that had once been a chamber in the Egyptian temple, the Romans applied a coat of plaster over the pharaonic reliefs and painted their own images. These paintings, discovered during the clearing of the temple in the 19th century, show 4 standing figures in Roman military dress, their arms raised in a gesture of acclamation. The figures are generally identified as the 4 co-emperors of the Tetrarchy, the administrative system established by Diocletian in 284 of the Common Era to govern the vast Roman Empire. The Roman paintings are crude by comparison with the Egyptian reliefs they cover. The figures are stiff, the proportions are awkward, the colours, reds, blues, whites, are applied without the subtlety that characterized Egyptian temple painting, and yet the paintings are historically priceless, one of the very few surviving examples of Roman imperial cult art in Egypt, and a rare visual record of the Tetrarchy depicted in an Egyptian context. The juxtaposition is extraordinary. Where the plaster has fallen away, the Egyptian relief are visible beneath the Roman paintings. Pharaonic gods and Roman emperors sharing the same wall, separated by a thin layer of plaster and 1700 years of history. The 2 layers are physically inseparable. They have been touching each other for 17 centuries, and together they tell a story that no single layer could tell alone, the story of sacred space being claimed, repurposed, and reinterpreted by successive civilizations. The Christian layer followed the Roman one. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the 4th century, the Roman cult chapel was converted, again, this time into a Christian church. Coptic crosses were carved into the stone walls, an apse was cut into the pharaonic masonry, a baptismal font was installed. The transformation was thorough. The room that had been an Egyptian temple chamber, then a Roman cult chapel, was now a Christian church. 3 religions in one room, 3 layers of sacred art on one wall, and beneath all of them, the pharaonic reliefs, the oldest, the most elaborate, the most theologically complex, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The medieval Islamic layer completed the sequence. The Mosque of Abu al-Haggag, built in the 13th century atop the accumulated debris that had filled the temple to a height of several meters, is the youngest and the most active of Luxor Temple religious incarnations. The mosque is dedicated to Sheikh Yusuf Abu al-Haggag, a local Sufi saint who is venerated as the patron of Luxor. His Mawlid, his annual festival, is one of the most important religious celebrations in Upper Egypt, drawing thousands of devotees who process through the streets of Luxor, carrying boats and banners, chanting prayers, and celebrating the saint memory. The boats are the most striking element of the Mawlid. They are wooden vessels, decorated with coloured cloth and flowers, carried on the shoulders of devotees through the streets of the city. The resemblance to the pharaonic bark procession of the Ipet festival is impossible to miss. The boats are different, simpler, smaller, ungilded. The route is different, shorter, confined to the area around the mosque, rather than stretching the full 3 kilometers to Karnak. The god is different. Allah, through the intercession of Abu al-Haggag, rather than Amun-Ra, through the mediation of the pharaoh. But the act, the public procession of sacred vessels through the streets of Thebes, is the same. The form has persisted, the content has changed. And the persistence of the form across 34 centuries and 4 religions is the most remarkable cultural continuity in the history of human worship. Whether the Mawlid is a direct descendant of the Ipet festival, transmitted from generation to generation through an unbroken chain of local tradition, or whether the resemblance is coincidental, a parallel invention produced by different cultures in response to similar social and geographic conditions, is a matter of scholarly debate. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The structural similarities are striking. The geographical overlap is exact. The temporal continuity, from the 14th century BC to the 21st century of the Common Era, is unprecedented. But proving direct transmission across 34 centuries through multiple changes of language, religion, and social structure is extraordinarily difficult. What is not difficult to prove is the persistence of the site. The ground is the same, the temple is the same, the river is the same, and the act of worship, the gathering of a community around a sacred object in a sacred place for the purpose of renewing its connection to the divine, continues, has continued, will continue, not because anyone decided it should, not because anyone ordained it, but because the ground holds, because the Sacred Heart beats, because the southern sanctuary, the birthplace of the royal car, the most intimate dwelling of the god, has never stopped being what it was built to be, a place where the human and the divine come closest to touching, and that touching, that moment of contact, that instant of renewal, that annual rebirth that the Ipet festival was designed to produce, may be the truest explanation for why Luxor Temple has never stopped being sacred. The building was designed for encounter. It was designed to create the conditions under which the human and the divine could meet. And those conditions, the progression from light to darkness, the narrowing of the spaces, the deepening of the silence, the concentration of the sacred, are architectural conditions, not theological ones. They work regardless of which god is being worshipped. They work for Amun-Ra, they work for the Roman emperor, they work for Christ, they work for Allah. The architecture creates the encounter. The theology merely names it, and this is Luxor Temple's ultimate gift to the world, not its reliefs, not its obelisks, not its statues, or its colonnade, or its birthroom. Its gift is the demonstrations that sacred architecture works, that a building, if designed with sufficient skill and sufficient understanding of the human experience of the divine, can create the conditions for encounter that no theology can create on its own. The building is the medium, the encounter is the message, and the message has been received without interruption for 3,400 years. The question of why Luxor Temple was built where it was built has received a new and fascinating dimension from recent geoarchaeological research. A study published in early 2026, using core samples taken from beneath the temple foundations, proposed that the site was chosen not for practical reasons, but for cosmological ones. The researchers found evidence that the temple was built on a low sandy island, a natural formation that was seasonally exposed when the Nile floodwaters receded. This island, the researchers argue, was understood by the ancient builders as a physical manifestation of the primeval mound, the Benben, the first piece of solid land that emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. If this theory is correct, then Luxor Temple was not merely built on sacred ground. It was built on the most sacred ground possible, the ground that enacted the creation myth in physical reality. The temple was the first land, the first mound, the place where existence began. And the Opet festival, which renewed the king divine essence in this primordial space, was not merely an annual ceremony. It was an annual recreation, a return to the first moment, a repetition of the first act, a renewal of the first birth. The king was reborn at Luxor because Luxor was where birth itself began. This interpretation connects Luxor Temple to the broader Egyptian understanding of sacred geography. In Egyptian cosmology, certain locations were not merely holy, they were cosmically significant, positioned at nodes in the divine landscape where the boundaries between the human world and the divine world were thinnest. These locations, the first cataract at Elephantine, the sacred lake at Karnak, the primeval mound at Heliopolis, were the places where the cosmic order was most accessible, where the divine energy was most concentrated, where the rituals performed by the priests had the greatest efficacy. Luxor Temple, on its sandy island, was one of these nodes, and the architecture of the temple was designed to amplify the cosmic significance of the site, to channel the divine energy of the primeval mound through the corridors and courts and sanctuaries of the building, concentrating it in the innermost chamber where the god resided and where the king was renewed. The temple was not a building placed on sacred ground. It was a machine built on sacred ground, a device for concentrating, channeling, and directing cosmic energy, designed with the same precision and intentionality that modern engineers bring to the design of electrical circuits. This analogy, the temple as a cosmic circuit, is not fanciful. The Egyptians themselves understood their temples in functional terms. The temple was a mechanism, a device with moving parts, the priests, the barks, the offerings, and static components, the walls, the columns, the sanctuaries, that worked together to produce a specific outcome, the renewal of the cosmic order. The daily ritual was the operating procedure, the Opet festival was the annual overhaul, and the architecture was the housing, the physical framework that contained and directed the functional components. When the mechanism stopped, when the rituals ceased, when the priests departed, when the offerings were no longer made, the housing survived but the function died. The temple continued to stand. The cosmic circuit was broken, and Luxor Temple, the most precisely calibrated cosmic machine in the Egyptian religious system, became an inert structure, its corridors still perfectly aligned, its chambers still perfectly proportioned, its columns still perfectly carved, but its purpose extinguished. A machine with all its parts intact but no power flowing through them. The subsequent religions that occupied the temple, Roman, Christian, Islamic, did not restore the original circuit. They built new circuits, new ritual systems, new functional programs, new ways of channeling the sacred energy that the site continued to generate. Each new circuit was different from the Egyptian one. Each produced a different outcome, but each was built on the same ground, in the same structure, using the same architectural spaces that the Egyptian builders had created. The housing was reused, the function was replaced, and the sacred energy, whatever its source, whatever its nature, continued to flow. The persistence of sacred energy at Luxor Temple is the phenomenon that demands explanation, not the persistence of the stone. Stone persists because stone is durable, not the persistence of the architecture. Architecture persists because it is embedded in the ground, but the persistence of the sacred, the quality that makes successive religions, across successive centuries, choose this specific site, this specific building, this specific ground as the location of their most intimate encounter with the divine. The sacred is not stone. The sacred is not architecture. The sacred is something else, something that the stone and the architecture create, channel, and sustain. But that is not identical to either of them. The sacred is the experience, the human experience of being in a space that feels holy, that evokes awe, that creates the conditions for encounter with something larger than the self. And that experience at Luxor Temple has been consistent across 34 centuries and 4 religions. The theology changes, the experience persists, and the persistence of the experience, rather than the persistence of any particular theology, is what makes Luxor Temple unique. We do not have a scientific theory of sacred space. We do not have instruments that can measure holiness. We do not have equations that can predict which locations will be recognized as sacred across multiple cultures and multiple centuries. But we have Luxor Temple. We have 34 centuries of empirical evidence. We have 4 religions, each one independently choosing the same ground. And that evidence, however we interpret it, however we explain it, however we categorize it, demands to be taken seriously. Something about this place makes it holy. The Egyptians knew it. The Romans knew it. The Christians knew it. The Muslims know it. And we, standing in the peristyle court at sunset, watching the shadows lengthen and the columns glow and the minaret darken against the evening sky, know it too. We feel it. We cannot explain it, but we feel it. And that feeling, that unexplained, unreduced, irreducible feeling of standing in a place that matters, is the sacred heart of Thebes, still beating, still alive, still refusing to be explained. The obelisks of Luxor Temple deserve special attention because their fate illustrates, with painful clarity, the modern world relationship with ancient monuments. Ramesses II erected 2 red granite obelisks before his first pylon, matched pairs, each roughly 25 meters tall, each weighing approximately 250 tons, each carved from a single block of Aswan granite and transported more than 200 kilometers downriver to Thebes. The obelisks were not merely decorative. They were theological instruments, solid beams of petrified sunlight, symbols of the sun god power, placed at the entrance to the temple to catch the first rays of dawn and to mark the boundary between the profane world outside and the sacred world within. For more than 3,000 years, the 2 obelisks stood where Ramesses had placed them, flanking the entrance to Luxor Temple, catching the morning sun, marking the threshold of the sacred. They survived the fall of the pharaonic state, the Roman occupation, the Christian conversion, the Islamic transformation, and the centuries of sand and neglect that buried the lower portion of the temple. They were still standing when Napoleon troops arrived in 1798, and they were still standing when, in 1831, the Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, gave one of them to France. The gift was diplomatic, a gesture of goodwill toward France, which had been Egypt's ally in various political intrigues. The logistics of the transfer were nightmarish. The obelisk, 23 meters of solid granite weighing 250 tons, had to be lowered from its pedestal, transported to the Nile, loaded onto a specially constructed barge, sailed down the river to Alexandria, transferred to an ocean-going vessel, shipped across the Mediterranean, and through the Strait of Gibraltar, sailed up the Atlantic coast to the mouth of the Seine, and towed upriver to Paris. The journey took more than 2 years. The engineering challenges were extraordinary. The obelisk had to be lowered using a system of ropes, pulleys, and timber frameworks that took months to construct. The French engineer who supervised the operation, Jean-Baptiste Apollinaire Lebas, later published a detailed account of the project that remains a classic of 19th century engineering literature. The obelisk arrived in Paris in 1833 and was erected in the Place de la Concorde in 1836. It stands there today, the oldest monument in Paris, older than Notre Dame, older than the Eiffel Tower, older than the city itself by more than 2 millennia. In 1998, a gilded pyramidion, a small pyramid-shaped cap, was placed on its tip, restoring something of the original appearance that the obelisk would have had at Luxor, where its tip was capped with electrum. But the obelisk in Paris is not at home. It is a displaced monument, a piece of Luxor Temple, removed from its context, standing in a European city, surrounded by traffic and tourists who know it as a Parisian landmark rather than an Egyptian sacred object. The obelisk still catches the sunlight, but it catches the wrong sunlight, the grey, filtered light of northern France, rather than the blazing gold of Upper Egypt. It still stands upright, but it stands on the wrong ground, the limestone of the Paris basin rather than the sandstone of Thebes. It still marks a threshold, but it marks the wrong threshold, the entrance to a traffic circle rather than the entrance to the house of Amun. The remaining obelisk, the eastern one, still stands at Luxor in its original position beside the colossal statues of Ramesses. It stands alone now, without its pair, the asymmetry visible and poignant. A matched pair, designed to flank a sacred entrance, has been separated by diplomacy and engineering. One stands in Egypt, one stands in France, and the gap between them, the empty space where the Western obelisk once stood, is a permanent reminder of the modern world capacity to disassemble the ancient one. Egypt has never officially asked for the obelisk return. France has never offered to send it back. The diplomatic gift of 1831 stands, as diplomatically permanent in its way, as the temple that the obelisk once served. And the obelisk in Paris, cleaned and illuminated and admired by millions, has become a monument to something its builders never intended, not to the glory of Amun-Ra, but to the power of modern nations to claim the heritage of ancient ones. The numbers are striking when you consider the scale of this displacement. Luxor Temple originally had 2 obelisks, 6 colossal statues, and hundreds of smaller sculptures and architectural elements. Today, the temple retains 1 obelisk, 2 seated colossal statues, and a fraction of its original sculptural program. The rest has been distributed to museums and collections around the world. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The temple has been partially disassembled by the very civilizations that claim to reveal. The Sacred Heart of Thebes has been removed, piece by piece, and placed in display cases on 4 continents. The conservation of Luxor Temple, then, is not merely a technical challenge. The stabilization of sandstone, the management of groundwater, the documentation of deteriorating reliefs. It is also an ethical challenge. The question of what belongs where, of who owns the ancient past, of whether a temple can be fully understood when its components have been scattered across the globe. The obelisk in Paris is magnificent, but it is not in Luxor, and Luxor Temple without it is incomplete. The sacred pair has been broken, the threshold is unbalanced, and the entrance to the most sacred space in ancient Thebes is marked, on one side, by absence. The colonnade of Amenhotep III is, by the consensus of most art historians who have studied it, the single most beautiful architectural space in ancient Egypt. This is a strong claim. The competition includes the hyperstyle hall at Karnak, the temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, and the inner chambers of the tomb of Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens. But the colonnade at Luxor possesses a quality that none of these other spaces quite matches. A quality of restraint, of proportion, of architectural confidence that does not need to overwhelm in order to impress. The 14 columns, 7 on each side, are not the tallest in Egypt. They are not the thickest. They are not the most elaborately decorated. But they are, by any standard of architectural judgment, the most perfectly proportioned. Each column is 16 meters tall, a ratio of roughly 1 to 12 relative to its base diameter. This is slenderer than the columns at Karnak, which are stockier and more massive. The effect is one of lightness, of stone aspiring to the condition of air, of massive sandstone columns that seem, against all physical logic, to float. The capitals, open papyrus flower capitals, carved with a precision that allows the individual petals to be distinguished, spread above the shaft like the canopy of a stone forest. The architraves that span the columns are massive, each one weighing many tons, but they are positioned so high above the visitor head that they do not oppress. The space between the columns is wide enough to allow the passage of the sacred bark without constriction. The proportions are calculated, not merely functional but aesthetic, designed to produce a specific emotional response in the viewer, and the emotional response is consistent. Visitors to the colonnade, whether they are Egyptologists or tourists, whether they arrive at noon or at sunset, whether they know the history of the Ipet festival or not, consistently describe the same experience, a sense of awe that is also a sense of calm. The colonnade does not intimidate, it elevates. It does not overpower, it embraces. The space is grand without being aggressive, sacred without being forbidding, beautiful without being self-conscious. It is, in the deepest sense, good architecture, architecture that serves its purpose so perfectly that the purpose becomes invisible and only the experience remains. Amenhotep III architect understood something that most architects, ancient and modern, do not. He understood that the purpose of sacred architecture is not to display the power of the builder. It is to create the conditions for encounter. The encounter between the human and the divine, between the temporal and the eternal, between the mundane world of daily existence and the numinous world of sacred experience. The colonnade creates those conditions. It creates them through proportion, through light, through the rhythm of the columns, through the silence that gathers in the spaces between the stones. It creates them without effort, without ostentation, without the bombast that characterizes so much religious architecture in every era. This is why the colonnade remains effective across cultures and centuries. A Muslim worshipper passing through the colonnade on the way to the Abu al-Haggag mosque feels the same elevation that an Egyptian priest felt 3,000 years ago. A Christian pilgrim in the 4th century felt it. A Roman soldier in the 3rd century felt it. The architecture works because it is addressed not to a specific theology but to a universal human capacity. The capacity to be moved by beauty, to be elevated by proportion, to be quieted by space. The colonnade speaks to the species, not to the sect, and the species, across every era and every faith, has listened. The Akhenaten interlude left its mark on Luxor Temple in ways that are still being uncovered. During his heretical reign, Akhenaten built a series of structures adjacent to Luxor Temple dedicated to the Aten, the sun disk that he elevated above all other gods. These Atenist structures, built using the small standardized blocks called talatat, were demolished after Akhenaten's death by Horemheb and his successors, who used the talatat as fill for their own constructions. Thousands of talatat blocks have been recovered from Luxor Temple and its surroundings, each one bearing painted or carved decoration from the Atenist period, each one a fragment of a dismantled heretical temple. The talatat tell us that the religious revolution that nearly destroyed the worship of Amun at Karnak also touched Luxor Temple, that even the sacred heart of Thebes was not immune to the upheaval that Akhenaten unleashed. The Atenist structures at Luxor were modest compared to those at Karnak, but their very existence demonstrates that Akhenaten intended to replace the entire Theban religious system, not merely the great state temple at Karnak, but the intimate sanctuary at Luxor as well. The Sacred Heart was to be stopped. A new heart, dedicated to the Aten, powered by a new theology, beating to a new rhythm, was to be installed in its place. The attempt failed. The old heart was restored. The new structures were demolished. The talatat were buried, and Luxor Temple, its sacred function renewed, its theological program restored, its Opet festival restarted, resumed its role as the most intimate dwelling of Amun-Ra, the place where the king was renewed, where the cosmic order was confirmed, where the divine and the human came closest to touching. But the talatat remain, buried in the walls and foundations of the restored temple, visible in museum collections and archaeological storerooms, testifying to the moment when the Sacred Heart of Thebes almost stopped beating. The interlude was brief, roughly 17 years, less than 1% of the temple active life, but it was traumatic, and the speed with which the old order was restored, the temples reopened, the festivals restarted, the names of Amun recarved on every surface from which they had been erased, suggest that the restoration was driven not merely by theological conservatism, but by genuine popular demand. The people of Thebes wanted their Opet festival back, they wanted their god back, they wanted the Sacred Heart back, and the pharaohs who followed Akhenaten gave them what they wanted, rebuilding what had been destroyed, renewing what had been interrupted, and carving the Opet festival reliefs on the walls of the colonnade as permanent proof that the interruption was over and the sacred rhythm had been restored. The Opet reliefs of Tutankhamun are, in this light, not merely decorative. They are restorative, visual evidence of a theological healing, carved in stone, placed on the walls of the very building where the healing occurred. The reliefs do not merely depict the festival, they proclaim its return. They declare, in carved and painted stone, that the cosmic circuit has been repaired, that the Sacred Heart is beating again, that the King Divine Essence has been renewed, and that the universe, interrupted by heresy, has been set right. And the setting right, the restoration, the renewal, the restarting of the sacred mechanism is itself an act of creation. The Opet festival was always about creation, the creation of the King Divine Nature, the creation of cosmic order, the creation of the conditions for continued existence. The post-Akhenaten restoration added another dimension, the recreation of what had been destroyed. The festival was now not merely an annual renewal, it was an annual resurrection, a bringing back from the dead of a theological system that had been deliberately killed and that had, against all odds, survived. Luxor Temple survived Akhenaten. It survived the Romans, it survived the Christians, it survived the Muslims, it survived the archaeologists and the tourists, and the rising water table, and the salt weathering, and the displacement of its obelisk to Paris. It has survived everything that 34 centuries of human history have thrown at it, and it survives today, damaged, incomplete, partially excavated, partially restored, partially obscured by a 13th century mosque, but alive, still sacred, still the heart, still beating. Amenhotep III's vision for Luxor Temple was not merely architectural, it was autobiographical. The birthroom reliefs, which depict the divine conception and birth of the pharaoh as the son of a moon, are the most personal inscriptions in the entire temple. They tell the story of a specific king, his mother Mutamir, his father Thutmose IV, in whose guise Amun appeared, his birth attended by goddesses, his presentation to the divine court. The reliefs are a family album in stone, a record of the most intimate moments of a royal life, from conception to coronation, carved on the walls of the most intimate room in the most intimate temple in Egypt. The birth narrative follows a precise iconographic program that had precedence, most notably in the birth colonnade of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, where the female pharaoh depicted her own divine birth to legitimize her unprecedented rule. Amenhotep III's adoption of the same program served a similar purpose. Though his legitimacy was less contested than Hatshepsut, the divine birth narrative reinforced the theological claim that every pharaoh was literally the son of Amun, conceived through divine intervention, born through divine will, destined for the throne from the moment of conception. The birthroom at Luxor Temple is small, only a few meters across, and its reliefs are damaged, with many of the painted surfaces faded or lost, but the surviving scenes are among the most remarkable in Egyptian art. The moment of divine conception, when Amun places the ankh to the queen nostrils and the inscription records that his dew filled her body, is rendered with a delicacy and a tenderness that is unusual in Egyptian monumental art, which tends toward the formal and the hieratic. The scene is intimate. The god and the queen sit together on the sign for heaven, their knees touching, their faces close. The goddesses who support them smile. The moment is quiet, tender, charged with divine significance, but also with human emotion. This is what sets Luxor Temple apart from every other temple in Egypt. It is not merely a house for a god, it is a house for a story, the story of how the divine enters the human, how the eternal touches the temporal, how the cosmic becomes personal. The Opet festival renewed this story annually. The birthroom preserved it permanently, and the temple, the building that housed both the renewal and the preservation, was the place where the story was told, retold, and reenacted, year after year, century after century, for 1300 years. The story has not been retold at Luxor Temple since the 4th century of the Common Era. The ritual has not been performed, the bark has not been carried, the god has not been fed, but the story is still there, carved on the walls, preserved in stone, readable by anyone who enters the birthroom and looks at the reliefs by torchlight or by the glow of a mobile phone screen. The medium has changed, the story has not. And the temple, the sacred heart that held the story, the house that sheltered the narrative, the building that served as the setting for the most intimate encounter between the divine and the human that Egyptian theology could imagine, still holds it, still shelters it, still serves. The deeper truth of Luxor Temple is the truth about sacred space itself, about the nature of holiness, about the persistence of the sacred, about what it means for a place to be holy independently of any particular religion. Every religion claims to create its sacred spaces. The church is consecrated, the mosque is sanctified, the temple is dedicated. The religion performs a ritual that transforms ordinary ground into holy ground. And when the religion departs, when the congregation disbands, when the faith is replaced, the holiness is supposed to depart with it. The ground reverts to the ordinary. The building becomes a shell, Luxor Temple contradicts this model. The ground did not become holy when Amenhotep III built his temple. The ground was already holy, already designated, already associated with a moon, already considered a sanctuary, before the first stone was laid. And when the Egyptian religion was replaced by Roman emperor worship, the holiness did not depart. When Roman worship was replaced by Christianity, the holiness did not depart. When Christianity was replaced by Islam, the holiness did not depart. The holiness has persisted through 4 religions. It has outlasted every god that was worshipped on its surface. It is not a property of the religion. It is a property of the place. This observation has implications that extend far beyond Egyptology. If sacred space can exist independently of religion, if holiness is a geographical quality rather than a theological one, then our understanding of the relationship between religion and place needs revision. We assume that religion creates sacred space. Luxor Temple suggests that sacred space creates religion, that certain places, by virtue of their physical characteristics, their geographical position, their accumulated history, draw religious practice to them the way a magnet draws iron filings. The religion is the response. The place is the cause. What makes a place sacred? The question has been asked by anthropologists, theologians, and geographers for centuries. The answers are various. Some point to natural features, springs, caves, hilltops, groves, that evoke a sense of the numinous. Others point to astronomical alignments, sites where the sun rises at the solstice, where the stars align with the horizon, where the cosmic order is made visible in the landscape. Others point to cultural memory, the accumulated weight of centuries of worship, the social knowledge that this place has always been holy, the tradition that sustains itself through repetition. Luxor Temple may combine all of these factors. The site is geographically prominent, elevated above the floodplain, visible from a distance, oriented toward the Nile and the rising sun. The 2026 geoarchaeological study that proposed the temple was built on land emerging from water, mimicking the primeval mound of creation, suggests that the site may have been associated with creation mythology from the very beginning, and the cultural memory of the site's sacredness, maintained through 3 millennia of continuous worship, has created a self-reinforcing tradition that each new religion has inherited from the last. Let that sink in. The most enduring sacred site in the world may owe its persistence not to any individual religion, but to a combination of geography, mythology, and cultural inertia. The ground was suitable, the mythology attached to it, the tradition sustained itself, and each new religion, arriving at the site and sensing its accumulated holiness, chose to build there rather than elsewhere, adding its own layer to the palimpsest, its own voice to the chorus, its own chapter to the story. And the story is still being written. The Mosque of Abu al-Haggag is active. Prayers are offered daily. The Moulid festival is celebrated annually. The people of Luxor worship on the same ground where Amenhotep III worshipped, where Roman soldiers painted their emperors, where Coptic Christians carved their crosses. The form of worship has changed, the location has not, and the persistence of the location, through every upheaval, every conquest, every conversion that the Nile Valley has experienced over 34 centuries, suggests that the Sacred Heart of Thebes is still beating. The question is whether it will continue to beat. The temple is now an archaeological site, managed, ticketed, conserved, and visited by millions of tourists each year. The mosque remains active, but its relationship with the surrounding archaeological park is complex and sometimes contentious. The tension between preservation and worship, between the temple as heritage and the mosque as a living sacred space, is one that the Egyptian authorities must navigate with care. But the tension itself is evidence of the temple's power. A building that generates no tension is a building that no one cares about. Luxor Temple generates tension because it still matters, not merely as a historical monument but as a sacred site, a place where the past and the present collide, where the archaeological and the devotional coexist, where the ancient and the modern are not metaphors for each other, but physical presences sharing the same walls. And this is the gift that Luxor Temple offers to anyone who visits. Not just the beauty of the architecture, not just the drama of the Opet festival reliefs, not just the engineering of the colonnade. or the elegance of the peristyle court. The gift is the demonstration that sacredness can endure, that holiness, whatever its source, can persist through changes of religion, changes of language, changes of culture, and changes of civilization. The gods change, the prayers change, the people change, but the ground holds, the stone holds, the sacred heart somehow keeps beating. The physical remains of each religious layer at Luxor Temple provide a unique opportunity for archaeologists and historians to study the process of religious conversion in material terms. When we speak of the Christianization of Egypt or the Islamization of the Nile Valley, we are usually speaking in abstract, sociological terms. The spread of ideas, the conversion of populations, the transformation of institutions. At Luxor Temple, these abstractions become physical realities. The conversion of the temple from pagan to Christian worship is visible in the stone, in the apse carved into the pharaonic wall, in the Coptic crosses scratched into the columns, in the plaster applied over the faces of the gods. The conversion from Christian to Islamic worship is visible in the mosque built atop the church, the minaret rising above the ruins, the prayer hall oriented toward Mecca, the faithful gathering where the faithful have always gathered. Each conversion involved both destruction and preservation. The Christians destroyed the faces of the pharaonic gods, chipping away the eyes, the noses, the mouths, to prevent the images from being objects of idolatrous worship. But they preserved the bodies, the columns, the walls. They destroyed the specific while preserving the general. They eliminated the god while maintaining the temple. The strategy was theologically motivated. The images had to be neutralized, but the result was architecturally conservative. The building survived, only the faces disappeared. The Islamic conversion was even more conservative. The mosque builders did not touch the pharaonic remains at all. They simply built on top of them, on the accumulated debris that centuries of occupation had deposited over the ancient floor. The mosque is physically separate from the temple. It sits on its own platform, above the pharaonic level, connected to the ancient structures only by gravity and geology. The two buildings coexist in the same space without touching. They are neighbors, not occupants, and the relationship between them, the mosque above, the temple below, is a perfect physical metaphor for the relationship between the religions they represent. Islam above, Egypt below, both present, both active, both claiming the same ground. The conservation challenges posed by this layering are formidable. The mosque is an active religious site, protected by both Egyptian law and Islamic tradition. The temple is an archaeological site, protected by Egyptian antiquities law and UNESCO World Heritage designation. The two sets of protections sometimes conflict. Archaeological excavation of the temple might endanger the structural stability of the mosque. Restoration of the mosque might disturb the archaeological record of the temple. Each intervention must balance the needs of both, the living faith and the dead one, the worshippers and the scholars, the present and the past. This balancing act is itself a form of sacred practice, a contemporary ritual of care and attention that mirrors, in secular form, the ancient rituals of maintenance that the priests of Amun once performed. The conservators who repair the sandstone are, in a sense, performing the same function as the priests who replastered the walls. The archaeologists who document the reliefs are, in a sense, performing the same function as the scribes who recorded the offerings. The work is different, the care is the same, and the building, recipient of that care for 34 centuries, continues to stand. Column beside column, stone upon stone, faith upon faith, century upon century, in the sacred heart of Thebes, and the Nile still flows past the temple walls. The river that once flooded annually, depositing the rich silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible and Egyptian civilization inevitable, now flows at a regulated level, controlled by the Aswan High Dam. The flood no longer comes, the silt no longer deposits. The ancient rhythm that governed Egyptian life for 3 millennia has been disrupted by modern engineering, but the river endures, and the temple, built on its bank, endures with it, facing the water, facing the east, facing the sunrise that has been its orientation since the first stone was laid. The relationship between the temple and the river is not merely geographical, it is theological. The Nile was the source of life. The temple was the source of legitimacy. The two were linked. The annual flood renewed the land, and the annual Opet festival renewed the king. When the flood came, the land was fertile. When the festival came, the king was divine. The two renewals were parallel, cosmic and political, natural and theological, occurring at the same time, in the same season, in the same city. The Opet festival was timed to coincide with the flood season. The Akhet, the season of inundation. When the Nile rose, the land greened, and the whole of Egypt was renewed. Today, the flood no longer comes. The dam has stabilized the river. The season of inundation is a memory. But the temple that was built to celebrate that season still stands, its walls still bearing the reliefs of the festival that once coincided with the flood, its court still oriented toward the river that once made the festival necessary. The temple remembers the flood, the river has forgotten it, and the gap between the two, between the temple memory and the river amnesia, is another of the small melancholies that accumulate in any ancient building that has outlived its context. But Luxor Temple has always been good at outliving its context. It outlived the pharaohs, it outlived the Romans, it outlived the Christians. It is currently outliving the modern archaeological establishment that studies it, and it will, in all probability, outlive us, outlive our theories, our documentaries, our digital archives, our 21st century certainties about the nature of the sacred. The temple does not care about our theories. The temple does not need our approval. The temple simply stands, as it has stood for 34 centuries, as it will stand for 34 more, in the sacred heart of a city that has changed its name, its language, its religion, and its government more times than anyone can count, but that has never, in 34 centuries, stopped worshipping on this ground, and the worship continues, every Friday. Every day, 5 times a day, the muezzin calls from the minaret of Abu al-Haggag. The call echoes off the columns of Amenhotep III. It passes through the air that once carried the chanting of the priests of Amun. It reaches the ears of the faithful, who gather in the mosque, remove their shoes, face Mecca, and pray, on the same ground where the pharaohs knelt, where the Roman soldiers stood, where the Coptic Christians crossed themselves, where the first builders of the southern sanctuary placed the first stone and spoke the first prayer to the first God who called this place home. The ground remembers every prayer, the stone holds every voice, and the sacred heart of Thebes, beating, still beating, refuses to stop. The Luxor Temple obelisk that now stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris has had an afterlife that its builders could never have imagined. It has witnessed the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars, and the daily traffic of one of the busiest intersections in Europe. It has been cleaned, restored, gilded, and illuminated. It has been the subject of poems, paintings, and postcards. It has become, in the century and a half since its installation, as much a Parisian monument as it is an Egyptian one. Its identity split between 2 cities, 2 continents, 2 civilizations. And yet, beneath the gilding and the floodlights, the obelisk remains what it has always been, a piece of Luxor Temple, carved from Aswan granite in the 13th century BC, inscribed with the names and titles of Ramesses II, designed to catch the morning sun at the entrance to the sacred heart of Thebes. The inscription is still legible, the hieroglyphs still spell the name of the king, the cartouches still proclaim his divine titles, and the granite, red, dense, crystalline, is still the same stone that was quarried from the Aswan cataract more than 3,000 years ago. The obelisk in Paris does not know it is in Paris. Stone does not know geography. The granite catches the light that falls on it, whether that light is Egyptian or French. The hieroglyphs say what they say, whether the reader is a priest of Amun or a tourist from Tokyo. The obelisk is indifferent to its location. It is indifferent to its audience. It simply stands, tall, slender, ancient, perfectly upright, and says what it has always said, that the king is divine, that the god approves, that the temple is sacred, and that the sun rises in the east. But the sun in Paris rises in a different east from the sun in Luxor. The light is different, the air is different, the sky is different, and the obelisk, for all its indifference to geography, is diminished by the displacement. At Luxor, the obelisk was one half of a matched pair, flanking a sacred entrance, catching the Theban sunrise, marking the threshold of the most intimate dwelling of the god. In Paris, the obelisk is a curiosity, an exotic ornament in a European plaza, admired for its age and its engineering, but stripped of its liturgical context, its theological purpose, its sacred function. The displacement of the Luxor obelisk is one of the defining acts of 19th century colonialism. The appropriation of an ancient sacred object by a modern European power, justified by diplomatic convention and accomplished through engineering virtuosity. The act was legal, it was consensual. The Viceroy of Egypt gave the obelisk freely. It was technically brilliant. The engineering of the transportation was a triumph of 19th century logistics. But it was also, in a deeper sense, a violation. The removal of a sacred object from its sacred context. The breaking of a pair that had been together for 3,000 years. The displacement of a monument from the only ground it was ever meant to stand on. And the remaining obelisk at Luxor, the eastern one, still standing, still in place, still flanking the entrance to the temple, stands alone now, without its twin, asymmetrical and incomplete. It catches the Theban sunrise, as it was designed to do. It marks the threshold, as it was designed to do. But it marks only half the threshold. The other half is in France, and the temple, entering its fourth millennium, must make do with one obelisk where there should be two. A permanent reminder that the Sacred Heart of Thebes, for all its persistence, has not been immune to the losses that time and politics and diplomacy inflict on every ancient place. Stand in the peristyle court of Amenhotep III at sunset. The columns cast long shadows across the stone floor. The light is amber, warm, turning the sandstone to gold. Above the eastern colonnade, the minaret of the Abu al-Haggag mosque rises into the darkening sky. To the south, the inner chambers of the temple disappear into shadow. To the north, the colonnade of Amenhotep leads toward the first pylon and the avenue of sphinxes beyond. The air is still. The tourists have mostly departed. And for a moment, a brief, suspended moment, the temple is quiet. This is the moment when Luxor Temple speaks most clearly. Not through its inscriptions, which require expertise to read. Not through its reliefs, which require context to interpret. But through its space. The proportions of the court, the rhythm of the columns, the relationship between solid and void, between light and shadow, between the enclosed and the open. The architecture communicates directly, without translation, without mediation. It speaks in a language that predates literacy, the language of space, of mass, of shelter, of orientation, a language that any human being from any century, from any culture, can understand. This is what the architects of the 18th dynasty understood that we have largely forgotten. They understood that architecture is a language, that buildings speak, that spaces communicate, that the arrangement of stone and light and shadow can convey meaning as precisely as any inscription. The Luxor Temple inscription tells us the name of the builder and the purpose of the building, but the architecture tells us something else, something about the human experience of the sacred, about the way that space can create mood, that proportion can induce awe, that darkness can evoke mystery. The Egyptians were masters of this architectural language. The progression from light to darkness, from the open courtyard to the enclosed colonnade, to the dim hypostyle hall to the black sanctuary, was a journey from the profane to the sacred, experienced physically by every priest who walked the axis and every worshipper who glimpsed the procession. The narrowing of the spaces, the lowering of the ceilings, the dimming of the light, all of these were architectural devices that created a sense of increasing sanctity, of approaching the divine, of leaving the human world behind. Modern architects still use these devices. The long nave of a cathedral, narrowing toward the altar, the dim interior of a mosque, lit by filtered light through geometric screens, the hushed galleries of a museum, separated from the noise of the street by multiple thresholds. These are the descendants of the Egyptian progression, the same architectural language, applied to different purposes, in different materials, by different cultures. And the language works. It has always worked. It worked at Luxor Temple 3,000 years ago. It works in every sacred building constructed today. And the reason it works is not cultural, it is biological. Human beings respond to certain spatial configurations in predictable ways. Darkness promotes introspection. Enclosure promotes focus. Height promotes awe. Rhythm promotes calm. These responses are not learned. They are evolved. the product of millions of years of adaptation to environments that rewarded attentiveness to spatial cues. The architects of Luxor Temple did not know about evolutionary psychology, but they understood the effects they were producing. They understood that a column 16 meters tall would inspire awe, that a ceiling painted with stars would evoke the sky, that a sanctuary in total darkness would feel holy, and they used these effects with a sophistication that modern architects, with all their technology, can barely match. Luxor Temple is not merely a historical monument. It is a masterclass in spatial design, a 3,000-year-old demonstration of how to use architecture to create meaning. And the meaning it creates, the sense of the sacred, the feeling of approaching the divine, the experience of being in a place that transcends the ordinary, is not dependent on the Egyptian religion. It is not dependent on any religion. It is a property of the space itself, of the proportions, the materials, the light, the darkness, the rhythm of the columns, the silence of the stone. This is what the persistence of Luxor Temple's sacredness ultimately means. The holiness is not in the god, it is in the architecture. It is in the space that the architects created, a space so perfectly calibrated to the human experience of the sacred that every subsequent religion has recognized it, instinctively, as holy ground. The gods change, the architecture endures, and the architecture, not the theology, is what sustains the sacred. The nighttime experience of Luxor Temple is one of the great spectacles of modern Egypt. The temple has been open for evening visits since the installation of its current floodlighting system, and the effect of the artificial illumination on the ancient sandstone is dramatic. The columns glow amber and gold against the black sky. The shadows are sharp and theatrical. The carved reliefs appear in exaggerated 3 dimensions, their depth enhanced by the oblique angle of the floodlights. The colossal statues of Ramesses II, lit from below, acquire a monumental intensity that daylight, for all its honesty, cannot match. The floodlighting is not historically accurate. The ancient Egyptians did not illuminate their temples from below with electric lights. The original lighting of Luxor Temple was far more subdued. Torches, oil lamps, and the occasional shaft of sunlight penetrating through doors or clerestory windows. The interior of the temple would have been mostly dark, a deliberate architectural choice, designed to create an atmosphere of mystery and sanctity. The floodlighting reverses this. It turns the temple inside out, illuminating surfaces that were meant to be hidden, revealing details that were meant to be glimpsed only by torchlight, transforming a space of intimate darkness into a spectacle of public radiance. And yet the nighttime temple has a power that the daytime temple does not. During the day, Luxor Temple is crowded with tour groups, its courtyards filled with the noise and motion of modern tourism. At night the crowds thin, the noise subsides, the temple becomes quieter, more contemplative, more itself. The floodlit columns stand in silence. The reliefs tell their stories to smaller, more attentive audiences. And the Mosque of Abu al-Haggag, its minaret illuminated against the night sky, presides over the scene with a quiet authority that the daytime bustle obscures. The nighttime temple is also the closest modern experience to the ancient one. Not because of the lighting. The ancient temple was darker, not brighter, at night, but because of the silence. The ancient temple, after the last daily ritual was performed and the shrine was sealed, would have been silent, empty of worshippers, inhabited only by the god in his granite chamber, wrapped in darkness and stillness. The nighttime temple, after the last tourists have departed, approaches this condition. Silent, still, the columns standing like sentinels in the lamplight, the sacred lake reflecting the stars, the minaret pointing at the same sky that the obelisks once pointed at. And in that silence, the specific architectural silence of a great stone building emptied of people, the temple speaks most clearly, not in words, not in inscriptions, in space, in proportion, in the relationship between column and sky, between stone and light, between the ancient and the eternal. The temple speaks in the language of architecture, the oldest language, the most universal language, the language that does not require translation or interpretation or belief. It speaks to anyone who enters. It has always spoken, and it will continue to speak, in sunlight and in floodlight, in daylight and in darkness, in every season and every century, for as long as the columns stand and the Sacred Heart beats. The construction quality of Amenhotep III building program, the precision of the column drums, the tightness of the joints, the regularity of the coursework, is among the finest in Egyptian architecture. The column drums were cut and fitted so precisely that the joints are barely visible, a paper-thin gap between massive sandstone cylinders that weigh several tons each. The surfaces were polished smooth before the reliefs were carved, creating a uniformity of texture that enhances the legibility of the hieroglyphs and the clarity of the figured scenes. The standard of craftsmanship is remarkably consistent throughout the temple, from the innermost sanctuary to the outermost colonnade. The quality of the carving, the precision of the proportions, and the sophistication of the compositional design are maintained without significant variation. This consistency suggests a single controlling intelligence, an architect or master builder who supervised the entire project and who maintained quality standards across every workshop and every construction phase. The most likely candidate is Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the vizier, architect, and sage who was later deified for his achievements, and whose mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes was one of the few non-royal mortuary temples permitted by the king. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was a genius, one of the great architects of the ancient world, a man whose buildings have survived for 3,400 years, and whose reputation for wisdom endured in Egyptian memory for millennia after his death. His masterwork is Luxor Temple, and his masterwork is still standing, still beautiful, still sacred, still the finest expression of New Kingdom architectural art, still the Sacred Heart of Thebes. And this understanding that architecture can create sacredness independently of theology has implications that extend far beyond Egyptology. If a building can be holy simply by virtue of its proportions, its orientation, its spatial qualities, then the architects of the modern world bear a responsibility that goes beyond structural engineering and aesthetic design. They bear the responsibility of creating spaces that can accommodate the human need for the sacred, spaces that can serve as vessels for the numinous, regardless of which religion or which century fills them. Luxor Temple was such a vessel. It was designed for Amun-Ra. It served the Roman emperors. It housed a Christian church. It supports an Islamic mosque. Each religion found in the temple a space that worked, a space that created the conditions for worship, for contemplation, for encounter with the divine. And the space worked not because it was designed for any particular god, but because it was designed for the human being, for the human body moving through space, for the human eye responding to proportion, for the human spirit responding to beauty. The architects of Luxor Temple created a building that has been holy for 34 centuries. No modern architect has achieved anything comparable, and the reason is not that modern architects are less skilled. It is that modern architects have forgotten what the ancient builders knew, that the purpose of sacred architecture is not to house a god. It is to create the conditions under which human beings can feel the presence of the divine. The god is optional. The conditions are essential, and the conditions, the proportions, the light, the silence, the progression from public to private, from light to darkness, from noise to stillness, are architectural, not theological. Luxor Temple proves this. It has been proving it for 34 centuries, and it will continue to prove it. Every sunrise, every sunset, every time a visitor walks through the first pylon and feels, without knowing why, that they have entered a place that matters, a place that has always mattered, a place that will always matter, the Sacred Heart of Thebes, still beating, still alive, still, after everything, the pharaohs, the Romans, the Christians, the Muslims, the archaeologists, the tourists, the 34 centuries of worship and neglect and worship again, still, inexplicably, beautifully, stubbornly, triumphantly holy. So what is Luxor Temple? It is the southern sanctuary, the Ipet Resyt, the private chambers of the god Amun-Ra, where the divine essence of Egyptian kingship was renewed each year during the Opet festival. It was built primarily by Amenhotep III around 1400 BC and expanded by Ramesses II around 1250 BC. It served as the ceremonial heart of the Egyptian state for roughly 1300 years. It was converted to a Roman fortress a Christian church, and an Islamic mosque, each conversion adding a layer to the building without destroying the ones beneath. And it stands today as the most complete example of religious continuity in the world, a building that has been sacred, without interruption, for 34 centuries. But Luxor Temple is more than a catalogue of its own history. It is an argument made in stone about the nature of the sacred. The argument is this: that holiness is not a property of gods, it is a property of places. That the sacred can persist through changes of theology, changes of culture, changes of civilization. That certain locations, by virtue of their geography, their history, their architecture, accumulate sacredness the way a battery accumulates charge, and that this accumulated sacredness can outlast any individual religion, any individual god, any individual act of worship. The evidence for this argument is the building itself. The building and its 34 centuries of continuous use. No theologian could construct a more convincing case. No philosopher could produce a more elegant demonstration. The evidence is not in a text. It is in a temple, and the temple, unlike a text, cannot be argued with. It simply stands, column beside column, stone upon stone, mosque above church above temple above bedrock, and lets the evidence speak for itself. Visit Luxor Temple at night, when the floodlights turn the sandstone to gold and the columns cast black shadows across the ancient floor. Stand in the peristyle court and look up at the minaret of the Abu al-Haggag mosque rising above the pharaonic columns. Listen for the muezzin call to prayer, and consider what you are hearing: a 13th century Islamic prayer, chanted from atop a 14th century BC Egyptian temple, in a building that has been sacred since before the Trojan War, before the founding of Rome, before the writing of the Hebrew Bible, before the birth of the Buddha, before nearly everything that we call civilization began. The prayer echoes off the columns. The columns were carved by hands that have been dust for 3,000 years. The stone was quarried from the earth before the English language existed, and the ground beneath the stone, the ground that has been holy for 34 centuries, the ground that has supported Egyptian gods and Roman emperors and Christian saints and Islamic holy men, the ground endures. The gods come and go, the ground remains. And at Luxor Temple, the sacred heart of Thebes, the birthplace of the royal car, the building that has never stopped being holy, the ground has been speaking for 3,400 years, not in any language, not in any theology, in stone, in space, in the silence between the columns and the light between the shadows and the continuity between the centuries. Listen, the ground is still speaking.